Thank you so much for bearing with me as we got our YouTube live working, and it's the just the fourth webinar in our 2020 Partners in Preparedness Summit, and I'm really excited to have all of you join us today, both the panelists, moderators, our guest speaker, and attendees. So you guys are awesome for spending your day with us, and I do want to just give a very short introductions to our first people who will be speaking. Tyler Haggerty is going to talk for a few minutes before we get started as our guest speaker, and he is a graduate of the Arizona Youth Leadership Forum, and he is currently an emergency management intern at the Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council, and he also has an internship at the Arizona Secretary of State's office. So we're really excited to have Tyler talk to us. Sara Cater is my coworker at the Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council, and so we both get to work on issues that affect individuals with disabilities, but even specifically on emergency preparedness. So I'd love to hear her input today. And then JJ Rico, who is from the Arizona Center of Disability Law, who also is working actively now on emergency preparedness here in Arizona. So I'm very excited to turn the floor over to our first speaker, which is Tyler. So thank you so much, and I'll talk to you if you have a tech problem.
There we are. Hello, everyone. I am Tyler Haggerty. As she just said, this is very exciting for me to be here as someone who is about to enter my second year studying public service and public policy with an emphasis in law at Arizona State University. This is a very interesting time for the realm of law and constitutional rights in general. I mean, COVID aside, everything that's going on in terms of protests we've seen and the administration's response to it, and everything going on in Portland now, this is a vital time to be discussing our rights granted to us by this nifty little document right here, lest we allow oppression to begin to reign supreme. And I mean, especially in times of turmoil or great emergency such as this pandemic, we see throughout history that those are typically the times in which governments will start to roll back individual rights because they have a scapegoat or an excuse for it. So this is just an absolute thrill to be here, and I look so forward to hearing from all of you and to learn more about this area that I want to pursue a career in. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tyler. I'm going to turn the floor over to Sara Cater. Thank you.
JJ, I think maybe it's you. Uh-oh, you're muted.
Excellent. I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you, Tyler, for that. I wish you luck in your studies. We need folks studying what you are, and especially if you're studying kind of the impact of law on people with disabilities, which is a passion of mine. Hi, everyone. I'm JJ Rico. I'm the CEO for the Arizona Center for Disability Law. We're the designated protection and advocacy agency in Arizona. And so we advocate on behalf of people with disabilities who've been abused, neglected, discriminated against. And so I'm very honored to be here, and I appreciate Sara and Sara Ann's invitation to be a moderator today and hear from some of the panelists that you all will hear from. It's interesting being a disability lawyer for the past 19 years and seeing changes, sometimes improvements. But when a pandemic hits, I think the true colors and how far we've advanced as a disability rights movement, and maybe how far we haven't advanced. And so I'm interested to hear from our panelists today on their views on the impact of the pandemic on people with disabilities, on the disability rights movement, and maybe their vision for what we have to do to make sure people with disabilities are included. As a background, the Arizona Center for Disability Law does have some experience with emergency preparedness. We had a grant from the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities to produce an emergency preparedness handout, and it was kind of a self-advocacy guide that folks could utilize, and we went around and did trainings, provided people with how to build their box for emergency preparedness. And I think at that time, which was probably, and Sara may remember this time as well, maybe 8-10 years ago, I don't think we were preparing for a pandemic. I think we were imagining maybe a fire, something else that may come into Arizona specifically, but I don't think we envisioned a nationwide pandemic at that point. And so looking back at our boxes that we built, I don't think we had enough items in there to survive 4 months like we're surviving now. And we most definitely didn't have probably enough resources to know how someone could navigate and live through a pandemic, and especially for such a long period of time. But with any tragedy, like Hurricane Katrina and others, you learn about improvements that need to be made, and I think our panelists may talk about that as well. So again, it's my honor and my privilege to be part of this, even as a moderator, to learn. The folks you're going to hear from today are much more learned in this specific area than I am, and so I'm not going to keep belaboring my points, so that you can hear from the panelists that we do have. I know we will have someone joining us a tad bit later, so I'm going to move around the order based on those that I've seen out there. But again, I think you all are really in for a treat today. Again, want to recognize Partners in Preparedness. This is so relevant, so necessary. Again, we're doing this virtual. I think that's the new way. And the last thing I'll say on the 30th anniversary of the ADA is that we need to make sure that all of our programs are inclusive of people with disabilities, not only to survive pandemics, but to access good resources and materials that are going to be provided today. And again, celebrate the 30th anniversary, July 26th, of an amazing law. I know Tyler held up the little booklet there. I'm thinking that's the U.S. Constitution you were holding up, Tyler. I'd like to see them start producing little pocket books of the ADA. That would be great. People carry those around, and especially when their rights are being taken away or challenged, somebody could pull out the ADA and kind of throw it down on a desk or somewhere when they're coming out. So let's start by getting to know our panel today. And so we do have 3 panelists today, and I'll introduce them just by name and then let them introduce themselves in a lot more detail. And feel free, we have plenty of time to learn about you, your background, your commitment to this topic, and then maybe what type of advocacy work you're doing, either nationally or in your state, based on how COVID's affecting you, either personally or again, your community. So we're going to start with, and I do see her out there, so we're going to start with Lydia XZ Brown. So Lydia, I know you have to be unmuted as well, so I'll just kind of talk through until I see your unmute. But please describe for everyone your work and what you do, and then there'll be some more detailed questions in round 2 when Sarah Cater asks you a few questions, but please introduce yourself.
This is Lydia Brown. I use they, them pronouns. I am a young East Asian person sitting in a room that has 2 windows with blinds. I'm wearing a t-shirt that says disability justice is love, and instead of the O in the word love, there is a heart there. And I'm looking right at the camera in the room that I'm in. I have been working for over 10 years as an advocate, an educator, an organizer, a strategist and a trainer, a speaker, and a writer for disability rights and disability justice. I'm also now an attorney, which is an interesting place to be. Thank you. I see the applause from Tyler. When I passed the bar and found out about it, my first reaction was, holy shit, really? Followed by, yes, never repeating that experience again. And I will wait out the 5 years for reciprocity. So I've been working on issues that primarily deal with interpersonal and state violence, targeting disabled people, especially at the margins of the margins, and particularly disabled people at the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, language, and nation. In the last year, I have also taken on work with a specific focus on algorithmic fairness and justice for disabled people, and what justice looks like when automated decision making and artificial intelligence and machine learning driven assessment are affecting every area of our lives. And do you want us to speak a little bit about the current pandemic, or would you like me to hold off on that till a little further in the conversation? You're also muted.
Oh, was that for? I think you can share a little bit if you'd like.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The pandemic obviously has affected all of us deeply, profoundly. It has exacerbated underlying and pre-existing mental health stressors and thrown into very stark relief the driving factors of structural, systemic, and institutional inequality and injustice that are baked into this country's DNA. We see that in the impact of widespread impoverishment and homelessness, in the impact of mass criminalization and incarceration, and in the impact of extreme spending on police and military instead of investment in directly impacted communities in supporting one another for healing and for justice. And in my work, particularly in leading the only fund that provides direct support to autistic people of color through redistributive justice and mutual aid principles, we just saw an uptick of hundreds of people now apply every month for assistance from the fund. And we used to receive a few dozen at most applications for assistance. And since most of our donations come from marginalized community members who are also disproportionately unemployed, underemployed, or precariously employed, we are constantly, even when we are bringing in donations, giving out money basically as fast as we get money from our own community members. And the reasons that people ask for funds are illustrative of the pandemic's effects on people's lives in reducing people's ability to buy food, reducing people's ability to maintain access to medication and other health care, reducing people's ability to succeed and receive financial support for their academics, to be able to pay their rent, pay their bills, or participate in activities for pleasure or joy. It affects everybody, and it affects multiply marginalized disabled people particularly dangerously and potentially in deadly ways.
Thank you, Lydia, and welcome to a group of attorneys. There's more attorneys on there here than I thought, so congratulations on that. Again, if you're looking to move out to Arizona, we may have a position, but again, you're doing great work right now, and it sounds like you're in the area of passion for yourself and on behalf of the disability community, so we appreciate that. Thanks so much. I think we're going to go. I'm looking at our panelists who have joined us thus far, and I'm going to go to John Myers. I know John, but you all don't know John. So, John, I'm going to let you describe yourself, and if I need to fill in anywhere or any other compliments I can bestow upon you, I will. If not, go ahead and shower yourself with praise and all the great work you do. So, John Myers, everyone.
Well, JJ, as usual, you are too kind, and most of it is undeserved. I'm John Myers. I'm Executive Director of the ARC of Arizona, a disability policy and advocacy organization serving people primarily with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I run the state chapter of the ARC. The ARC is a national organization, again, serving people with IDD for the last 70 years. And proud to have been a part of some of the most groundbreaking legislative and advocacy events over the last 7 decades. I, of course, have not been with the organization that long. In addition to being, I believe, the only non-attorney or non-attorney to be on this panel. I have a relatively short tenure. I've been with the ARC about 7 years, and fortunately have been involved in some important work here in the state of Arizona, but only not taking absolute credit for it on behalf of the ARC, but fortunate to have been collaborating with organizations like ACDL and AZ Silk and a number of other organizations around the state in forwarding the cause of rights and services for individuals with disabilities in Arizona. The pandemic, as Lydia said, the pandemic has affected everyone's life, and it is absolutely true that it has had a tremendous impact on individuals with disabilities in Arizona, and individuals with IDD are, of course, the ones I work most closely with. It's interesting because in a typical year, I would be spending most of my time during the late winter and spring at the State House, at the Capitol in Phoenix, working on legislative issues. Because our legislature adjourned early this year, we spent far less time on legislative issues. But what we discovered as the pandemic hit, and as Arizona itself was hit pretty seriously by the pandemic, was that while we had less work to do on the legislative front, we had seemed exponentially more work to do on the advocacy front. A number of key issues arose very early that we needed to address. Issues dealing with equity, issues dealing with access, issues dealing with basic rights for individuals with disabilities, and in a number of different arenas. Those could be healthcare, education, transportation, housing, employment. All of these came to the fore very, very early after the pandemic hit, and all of those are areas in which we continue to work quite strenuously to make sure that the populations we serve, that the individuals in Arizona who have disabilities or come from communities of color or are aging adults, individuals who historically have been subject to far too much discrimination in our state and in our country, are protected, and that their civil rights are respected and honored, and that they are not put at a disadvantage relative to the community as a whole. So I think I'll have a chance to talk a little bit more as we go on about some of the specific initiatives we've been involved in. But I can tell you, somewhat ironically, it seems things have actually gotten busier since the pandemic struck. I suppose that's maybe not such a surprise, given all the uncertainty around this issue and this circumstance. But it is surprising to me. It is in a slightly different vein than we would have been normally used to, but it is important work. And again, we have the honor of working with some tremendous organizations, some tremendous collaborators in, we hope, bringing about progress on these issues. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, John. No, I wholeheartedly agree with the partnerships, and we had established partnerships prior to a pandemic, but I think those are solidified, and I think when we were coming together and trying to produce not only documents but also advocacy letters, the ARC and other organizations were on the front of those that you need to collaborate with, and so I think the pandemic has brought some of our organizations closer. We've added a few through this time, but most definitely we need our partners at this time, and maybe we'll have some discussion about that on how we can build stronger coalitions, expand those coalitions, especially because of the intersectionality of disability and all the other communities that John and Lydia have spoken about. So again, thank you both for being here. I do not see, and someone please correct me before we move on, has Rhonda Brownstein joined our panel?
No, not yet.
Okay, and Brandy was unable to join us today, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think you're going to still learn a great deal, both from Lydia and John, but that means you all have plenty more time to answer, elaborate, and talk on these questions that Sara Cater's about to ask you. And I had the honor of working with Sara Cater for a number of years at the Arizona Center for Disability Law, where she was a staff attorney, and we both were attorneys there at the center. So now she's at AZ Silk, and so Sara, it's all yours.
Thank you. Just echoing what everyone said, it's an honor to be with you all. These are truly bizarre and unprecedented times, as I am obviously in my home office with my husband, who's a public defender, in the other room, working with our 8-month-old baby taking a nap, and hopefully, and our 4-month-old, who knows, probably wreaking havoc in our home. So these are very interesting times, and it's been such an honor to continue to be a disability rights advocate more than ever. Seeing how, as you all have said, how these just highlight the inequities in society even further, and make me so committed to bringing about the change that we all have been calling for years and years and years and years, and now it's just even more so the case. So I'm glad we have an opportunity to discuss this today. So I am going to move on to some questions for Lydia and John, and hopefully Rhonda can join us at some point. So Lydia, I'll start with you. You were quoted in a New York Times article, which is part of a series exploring how the Americans with Disabilities Act has shaped modern life for people with disabilities. As a disability rights advocate and attorney, how do you feel the ADA has changed the situation we face today with COVID-19, if at all?
This is Lydia. I've been in conversations for much of this week with people who want to know, what do you think the ADA means for disabled people? And over, I keep telling folks that it's important and necessary for us to recognize that the ADA was a landmark achievement for disabled people. It was the first and broadest, most sweeping piece of civil rights legislation that affected people with disabilities across the lifespan in the United States. The prior laws that we've passed on disability rights, like the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, applies only to federally funded programs and services, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, originally passed as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, also 1973, was also only applied to people of school age, up to age 22 at oldest, did not apply after that. So the ADA applying broadly across all spheres of life to disabled people with all types of disabilities, and not just limited to federally funded programs and services and activities, was a major accomplishment. And at the same time, it's been 3 decades. And 3 decades since passage of the ADA until it was signed into law, 3 decades later, government agencies, local, state, and federal, schools, whether they're private or public, nonprofit organizations, for-profit corporations, and even and especially disability advocacy organizations openly, flagrantly, and blatantly violate the ADA. And so we have this law on paper. It guarantees us the legal rights to equal access, to equality of opportunity, to appropriate accommodations, and to be free of discrimination. That's essentially what it is, a non-discrimination law. And yet, the promise of the ADA remains unfulfilled, particularly for queer and trans disabled people, for disabled people of color, for disabled people who span many experiences and identities of marginalization and oppression. We remain left behind and left out. So in looking at what the ADA means for us now in the COVID-19 pandemic, on the one hand, it offers us, at least in theory, a set of de jure laws that will help advocate for disabled people who are most likely to be and already are hardest hit by the effects of the pandemic, through unemployment, through homelessness or housing or food insecurity and precarity, through lack of access to education, through lack of access to in-person based social services, and also through over-surveillance and monitoring and criminalization done by particularly to hyper-surveilled and criminalized communities within the disabled community. Everywhere you look, healthcare discrimination, care rationing, the ability of the government to actually respond to the crises that its incompetence and ineptitude has enabled and perpetuated. In theory, we can fight against those harmful effects by using the ADA and deploying it strategically. But as any community organizer will tell you, it doesn't really matter when we have all these nice shiny laws, because at best, those laws help us deal with harm and violence after the fact. They don't help us prevent the harm. You can't legislate morality. Again, it's been 3 decades since we passed the ADA, and yet ableism still exists and is perpetuated structurally, systemically, institutionally, and interpersonally. There is no way that simply passing laws or even better enforcing those laws will also eradicate the social and cultural values that our society uses to dehumanize disabled people, leading to our deaths, denial and deprivation of care, denial and deprivation of the basic services and supports that we all need in society to be able to thrive and live in community. So the ADA, we can use it as a powerful tool, and we should. But also, we need to understand the limitations of the law, both as a factor structuring and shaping our society, and in its utility and usefulness to those who are most impacted in what it means for us to upend the violence that marks every day of our lives.
Thank you so much. So have you seen in your work at all, have you seen like a specific use of the ADA that has benefited any individual or group at this point, or do you think it hasn't had a serious positive impact related to the pandemic?
This is Lydia. In addition to an outside of the pandemic, of course the ADA has led to important and necessary changes. It was the ADA that led the Supreme Court to render its landmark decision in 1999 in the Olmstead v. LC case, which guaranteed a right to community integration for disabled people receiving services. And we see now that the most effective fights against states and hospitals that seek to implement ableist care rationing policies using the ADA as a means to stop implementation of those policies wherever we can. But at the same time, for every success that we have, we also have to look at, again, the limitations of what that success is. We can win a court battle, but does that court battle necessarily translate into meaningful on-the-ground change? Michael Hickson, the Black disabled man left to die in Texas because the hospital made the decision to withhold care for COVID-19 due to perceived assumptions about his quality of life. I don't think that Matthew Hickson or that Michael Hickson or his family, would be saying, well, the ADA and the ability to win a ruling against the hospital is somehow going to replace the fact that he was left to die.
Yeah, absolutely. Such an excellent point. I think many of us read of that story, and it's atrocious. I will say, on this topic, the Center for Disability Law and the ARC and ACDL had been working on it in Arizona specifically. ACDL had been on this issue early, writing to the governor's office here in Arizona about concerning the care that people with disabilities could be receiving at hospitals. And just a few weeks ago, there was a coalition that, including all of the organizations represented here, that wrote a letter to the governor's office because the crisis standards of care were put in place, and we were alleging could be used to discriminate against people with disabilities and older adults based on life stages. You know, this sort of notion of quality of life, and if you're not going to meet certain life stages, or may not, then they might choose someone else to provide care to someone else over that individual. And I know that, what are days anymore? A few days ago, ACDL and some other nonprofit law firms filed an Office of Civil Rights complaint, based on these policies that we think we don't know, I guess, if any have actually been used, maybe. But so that's obviously an ongoing issue. And to circle back to what this question was about the ADA, this complaint was filed alleging discrimination in part under the ADA. So your point is very well made that these processes take time. Lives may be being lost as we speak through this because it's sometimes hard to get the relief that's needed under these laws, but many of us are still trying nonetheless. So thank you for that. John, I'm going to move on to a question for you. Individuals working in the field of emergency management and members of the public who follow COVID-19 news are aware of the increased risk for virus transmission in group housing. In an AZ Central News article, you discussed how containing COVID-19 in a group home setting is nearly impossible. with this in mind, should the operators of these facilities be given legal immunity from the resulting harm of COVID-19? And apart from any legal immunity, how do you think they should handle this?
The issue of legal immunity is a tricky one, and especially because I'm not an attorney, I don't necessarily feel qualified to tackle that. I'm gonna leave that to those of you who have passed the bar or are likely to pass the bar. I will say that the notion of providing legal immunity is disturbing. You probably know that in the state of Arizona and federally, there have been efforts in recent months to pass immunity laws that would exempt, for example, long-term care facilities from responsibility for individuals who have contracted the virus and died within those facilities. You can certainly make an argument, I think to a certain degree we would make the argument that that lets providers off the hook. But I want to be careful because the pandemic came on as a surprise to most people. The virulence of the pandemic, of this virus, came on as a tremendous surprise to most people. And to be honest, healthcare providers for people with disabilities, long-term care providers were utterly unprepared for it across the country. I don't know that I would advocate for immunity. I don't know that I would argue strenuously against immunity at this point. The point is, we have to, as a society and as a system, we have to make it possible for those who provide care for the people we represent to be as well prepared as they possibly can. And once we know of the impacts that something like this can have, we have to make available the resources to help them do the very best job they can to control the spread of a virus like this. One of the key shortcomings in Arizona and elsewhere has been provision of funding and provision of PPE, personal protective equipment. We have done a derelict job in making sure that providers in our state have the money they need to get PPE and have the resources to turn to secure PPE. We should never have allowed that situation to arise. The federal government should never have allowed a situation like this to arise. So if anyone, again, I want to be careful about pointing the finger, but if anyone is responsible, I think it has to be our government entities for not making it possible for our providers to respond in a way that was adequate to the need. Providers, of course, have to do the very best job they can within whatever resources they have. And I have to believe, actually, that in most cases across the state, they have done that. If we look at the number of diagnoses among All-Tex members in Arizona, the long-term care system members in Arizona, as of this Monday, 577 individuals have been diagnosed positive with COVID-19. Relative to other states, that's not bad. Fewer than 600 cases out of, tens of thousands around the state. That's not bad. It's more than we would ever want to see, obviously. But it proves that generally speaking, we've done a fairly good job of keeping the numbers low. And only 27 people, and I want to be careful, I say only 27, but 27 individuals with IDD who are on the long-term care system have died in Arizona since the pandemic began. Again, more than we would ever want to see, but in relative terms, it proves that, to my mind anyway, that providers are doing a fairly good job of keeping things under control in their residential setting. Now, that being said, if you look at those numbers, twice as many people have died in licensed residential settings in Arizona than have died in family-owned homes or with family caregivers. So that's concerning. That's worrisome on a statistical level. And I apologize if I'm going off on a bit of a tangent. I simply don't have an easy answer to whether immunity should be provided. What I do have to say is that we as a system, and that's providers and the funders who keep those providers in business, have to do the very best job available and must provide the resources necessary to protect the people we serve, to keep them out of harm's way. Once the coronavirus has entered a group setting, a group home, or an ICF, it is going to spread. We know this from empirical data across the nation. So we have to do everything possible to keep it out of those settings in the first place. And that really, because so many group home members are essentially sheltering in place, the responsibility then is upon the people who work there, who come and go. Family members are not coming and going. They're not getting visitors. The visitors essentially have been shut out. It's the employees, it's the staff members who are the most likely to bring it into that environment. We have to be very, very diligent about ensuring that those employees are not coming to work sick, and if they are coming to work, they're being tested on a regular basis to ensure they're not bringing the virus into those facilities.
Thank you, John. Just kicking it to the other lawyers on the call, I don't know if JJ or Lydia, you have a perspective or opinion on the legal immunity question.
So this is JJ. Not knowing enough about legal immunity and the standards, I think personally, I think that if there's concrete evidence that there was a failure to protect the residents or patients of a facility, then I don't think they should be immune at all. But if as John said, this pandemic, no one was really prepared. I mean, I think we've seen as a society, I don't think we were adequately prepared, no matter what the field, whether that be hospital settings or others. But you do get reports out there that there was some conscious decisions to place people in settings or together in a way that was not safe. And so if you can see clear negligence on behalf of a facility, or someone who said, let's keep that quiet, or don't report that you're feeling sick, which there's reports out there of, those should not be written as exceptions. Those should be highlighted, and light should be shined that this should never happen again. And I think there's a lot that both Lydia and John have said that when it's kind of my time to pass it back to them with some questions I'll add to. But on the immunity, it's hard to say yes, and most, because blanket immunity is something that, again, the ADA is an individualized inquiry, and to use that kind of as a framework, I think each individual circumstance is different. And so I don't think you should cast a big blanket or net and say, oh yeah, everyone should be immune during this time. And I'm worried that that's being tied to the next stimulus package is what I'm hearing. And when money and politicians are involved, unfortunately, the wrong decisions are made. And that's just me speaking personally. I think we should not mix those two, but that's what I'm hearing, is that the next package is tied to some type of immunity, whether that be for employers, or the like. But it concerns me that we would provide immunity, especially in the circumstances where there's clear negligence, that there was a decision to expose someone to a virus that does kill and kills at much greater rates for people with pre-existing conditions. So that's my take. Lydia?
This is Lydia. I would add to that conversation that immunity clauses in any number of agreements and contracts and policies that are arising now out of states' attempts to reopen and return people to regular business operations in schools and workplaces and elsewhere are just evidence of how broken and really broken is the wrong word, but of how fundamentally flawed, it's designed that way, our legal system is, where if you're on the other end of an immunity clause, then you lack the bargaining power to do anything about it. If your employer, for example, tells you, well, you have to show up to work, but also if you show up to work, you release me from any potential liability if you contract or are exposed to COVID while you're on the job, do you actually have a meaningful choice to say, well, no, I'm not really comfortable with that, when saying that means that you're probably going to be told, well, we don't have a job for you. We can't pay if you don't show up to do your job. And, other advocates, especially in their labor and labor justice world, have been talking about just how devastating at a structural level Congress's potential refusal to extend unemployment related to the pandemic will be. There is a justification economically to end the use of the pandemic unemployment program and to let it expire in a couple of days from now, as it's set to right now. Because if that expires, people who've been out of work due to the pandemic will no longer be able to claim unemployment benefits, especially those that only qualify for the pandemic unemployment assistance program and not for regular unemployment. And their employers will be able to use that to coerce people to return to work in unsafe conditions, which will necessarily have a disproportionately harmful and potentially deadly impact on disabled and disabled multiply marginalized employees who do not have the bargaining power to say no thank you. And without that assurance of a safety net in place, do not have a meaningful option to make sure that you can eat, that you can stay housed somewhere, because your choice is risk dying from COVID-19 but pay your rent, or don't pay your rent and risk dying from COVID-19 because you've been put out on the streets. It's not really a choice at all.
Thank you. I think those are excellent points, and I think I'm going to now turn it over to JJ.
Great. Well, thank you again for everyone, and I appreciate the responses. Just a couple of my thoughts are based on both what we heard Lydia say and what John shared. Lydia, I really appreciate the take on kind of the 30-year reflection on kind of maybe how far we've come or not come, and the work that still needs to be done. And the one thing that I would say as an attorney that's used the ADA for 19 years, which I think we've been a good advocacy organization, I'm not going to disagree. There's a long way still to go. What I would say, and what I say to a lot of clients, is the law can only go so far, and I think this is a point that you were kind of making, but there also needs to be other advocacy out there. You know, the law either needs to be expanded, or you also need to, and I did not hear you say this, so these are my words. I think there also needs to be an upswell of a disability rights movement that's more inclusive. I did hear you say that disability rights historically has not been the most inclusive movement out there, and I do think, you know, having gone through.
Let me just interject for a
Yeah, go ahead, Lydia. Sure.
When we talk about disability rights, we're speaking about something very distinct from disability justice. Disability justice movements have always been led by disabled people at the margins of the margins. Disability justice work centers and is led by queer and trans disabled people of color. But disability rights movements and organizations are overwhelmingly and predominantly led by white, straight, moneyed, degreed men, and with people with very specific types of disabilities often as well. So there's a distinction to be made. When people talk about disability advocacy, it's not necessarily clear who they mean or what they're talking about. So let's be very precise with our language and with our framing. Disability communities always mean both those with and without privilege within those communities, within that space. Disability and disabled people means both disabled people who experience various forms of privilege, power, and access to resources, and disabled people who are additionally marginalized or experience oppression, negative racialization, deprivation, exploitation, etc., in addition to being disabled and facing disability oppression or ableism. So when we talk about disabled people and disabled communities, if we say disabled communities have not been inclusive, we're actually reinforcing the notion that disabled communities should be centering only white and other privileged disabled people within it. So let's be very clear what we mean. Disability rights spaces have been white dominant, have been male dominant, have been exclusive of people with communication disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and psych disabilities. But disabled communities means all of us, privileged or marginalized within that space. And disability justice work has always been led by multiply marginalized disabled people.
No, I thank you for that, and I really appreciate you explaining that, because that even further, you know, kind of, I wasn't very eloquent in the point I was trying to make. So I think that you clarifying that most definitely shows that there's some work that still needs to be done. So I appreciate that. And then something that John said that I just want to kind of jump on is that we could use as an advocacy tool. Is if in Arizona, which we are a leader in home and community-based service, if the numbers do bear out, no one should have gotten it, but if those in community-based settings or their private homes had a lower rate of infection and death than those in kind of the more congregate, more institutional type settings, it could be really an interesting tool that we should, as a disability movement, kind of put forth to say this is why we need to move out of these congregate settings. I mean, I think we, as advocates and as individuals, can say that these settings are a way of the past, but we may need to argue that when a pandemic hits, it's shown that people are more subject to harm and to death if they're living in certain environments. So I appreciate those stats. I did not know those numbers, so I appreciate you sharing those, John. So there are a few more questions both for John and Lydia. And John, we'll start with you this time. And Sarah Cater mentioned that there was a complaint filed by the ACDL, the ARC of Arizona, the Center for Law and the Public Interest, Native American Disability Law Center, a couple individuals, and I think I might be missing another organization or two, on the Arizona's crisis standards and those discriminating against older Arizonans, people of color, and people with disabilities. Can you give a little bit more detail about that complaint, and then also maybe some of the evaluation methods that were in our crisis standards of care and how that could lead to discrimination?
Sure, this is John. Thanks very much for the question, JJ. The Crisis Standards of Care plan, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a plan adopted in most states. Not every state has one, but most do, that tries to spell out how scarce or limited healthcare resources will be allocated to the public in the event of an emergency, whether it's a pandemic, natural disaster, something of that sort. Arizona's original plan was developed in 2013. It was revised in 2018, and then it was revised again in this spring of 2020 after the pandemic hit. One of the things that ACDL in particular noticed early on was that Arizona's plan, while not the worst plan out there by any means, offered too many opportunities for discrimination against marginalized communities and vulnerable communities, in particular people of color, people with disabilities, and aging adults in the state. ACDL submitted a letter to the governor's office very early on, I believe it was in late March, perhaps early April, addressing the concerns that the center has on these shortcomings in the state's plan. To my knowledge, ACDL received no response from the state of Arizona. And so as the numbers stayed under control pretty well here in Arizona while there was essentially a shutdown, I think for most of us, it became less of a concern because it didn't seem likely that the plan was going to have to be put into place. Unfortunately, following the Memorial Day weekend, as Arizona opened back up, as individuals went out without any face coverings, as individuals interacted closely with one another, and as a result, as we watched the case numbers skyrocket in Arizona, the death rate increase, hospitalizations increase, it became abundantly clear that this plan was going to have to be put into place. And sure enough, the Hospital Association in Arizona actually requested of the Department of Health Services that the Crisis Standards of Care plan be implemented. Now, just because it was implemented didn't automatically mean that there was going to be discrimination in the allocation of healthcare resources. It would require reaching the highest level of crisis, essentially known as the triage level in our state, before decisions would have to be made between one person and another regarding, say, the use of a ventilator or a hospital bed or provision of any other sort of life-saving health care. We still have not reached that point in Arizona, but again, because we saw the numbers going up, we recognized that we were in a state of crisis and that the possibility or likelihood of reaching that triage level was upon us. And at that point, again, ACDL leading the charge, the ARC of Arizona, Center for Law and the Public Interest, Native American Disability Law Center, some private individuals, and a number of other organizations came together and issued a new call to the governor's office and the Department of Health Services to make changes to this plan so that the individuals we represent are protected, so that they are not going to be discriminated against based on implicit biases or inaccurate assumptions about quality of life, so that they have an equal right to the provision of health care alongside every other person in the state. If we were to reach that triage level, obviously some decisions would have to be made. Our point is those decisions can't be made based on illegal determinations. You cannot use race, color, ethnicity, disability status, or other criteria to make a determination about whether one person or another gets care. You cannot make irrational or uninformed decisions about the likelihood of a person surviving over a certain period of time. You can't use biased quality of life standard to make a decision. You can't say, for example, that a person with a disability automatically has a lower quality of life than someone without a disability, or that because somebody is in their 70s or 80s, that person has a lower likelihood of surviving for 1 to 5 years than somebody who's in their 20s, for example. There were too many of these opportunities written into Arizona's plan, and those are simply immoral and illegal when it comes to making the kinds of decisions that have to be made. So our complaint to the governor's office, or our contention to the governor's office, our request, was that these things be tightened up, that accommodations for individuals with disabilities be included, and that the opportunities for discrimination and bias be taken out. Because we heard nothing after an allotted period of time from the state of Arizona, we decided to pursue a formal complaint with the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services. That complaint has now been filed. It was filed last Friday. We assume it will take some period of time for it to be addressed, but we also know that OCR was expecting it. They'd been given a heads up. So we are optimistic that it will receive an expedited review, and that discussions with the state of Arizona will begin in very short order to make sure that the plan is corrected where it needs to be corrected, and the individuals who would be likely to suffer under it immorally and illegally will not be put in that position should Arizona reach the triage level. Now, obviously, we all hope that it never gets to that point. We hope that things stabilize and that, in fact, numbers begin to go down. We haven't seen evidence of that yet. We continue to see multiple thousands of people in Arizona every day diagnosed positive with the coronavirus. We see it in other states as well. And, at least in my opinion, the state of Arizona is not taking the necessary steps to ensure that as a population, we are protecting each other and ourselves from the continued spread of this. So my fear is that we are going to see a rapid increase in the number of cases and probably a rapid increase in the number of deaths associated with it. And if that happens, we want to make sure that the people we represent, people who deserve an equitable opportunity to access healthcare, receive that opportunity.
Thank you, John. No, we're obviously appreciative of the partnership again, and we want an answer quickly. We know other states who have filed similar complaints. HHS was Health and Human Services was quick to act, and so we're hoping we get some action from the federal agency on our complaint quickly, and give some guidance to Arizona, or give them the action they need to take so that persons with disabilities are not subject to what we spoke about earlier, the gentleman from Texas, or anything else that might impact our communities and the communities that have been most impacted by COVID. My next question is for Lydia. It's regarding technology. We're on a webinar today, and I know that you've written an article both in Digital Trends, and I saw another article talking about contact tracing and also the use of technology and how that is affecting people with disabilities. So let's start with the education field. Obviously, we're talking about maybe going back to school, having kind of social distance learning, and how that might impact people with disabilities. I think it was in Digital Trends you brought up many of the accessibility features used were implemented because of litigation by disabled people. Now we're needing to use those. So despite living in a post-ADA world, or 30 years after the ADA's passed, why do you think legal action is still necessary to ensure access for individuals with disabilities regarding technology?
This is Lydia. 98% of all web content fails to meet the WCAG 2.0 guidelines for best practice for accessibility of web-based content. 98%. So that might mean that an individual website or program or application could be accessible to at least some disabled people, but is almost certainly inaccessible to many other disabled people for a variety of reasons. Whether that's disabled people that use alternate modes of pointing and clicking and navigating a screen, input or output, whether that's through a braille display or voice-to-text user, or whatever it is that someone needs in order to fully access and use content online. 98%. In just the last few years alone, universities like Harvard and MIT have been sued very publicly for failure to make their online courses accessible to disabled students. And disabled students in the K-12 context are almost certainly going to have an even harder time both accessing material that is provided and expected to be used for studying, for examinations, for assessments, and so on, and in even necessarily having access to devices that are capable of accessing and navigating content. The digital divide, as a lot of people like to call it, most profoundly affects low-income communities of color in which disabled people are disproportionately overrepresented. And then that burden falls twice on disabled people from multiply marginalized communities. Few disabled people in multiply marginalized communities have the same access to devices capable of displaying web-based content and a reliable broadband connection. And secondarily, do disabled students in multiply marginalized communities have the same likelihood of access to the material even if they have a good broadband connection and a device capable of displaying the content? And the answers to both of those questions are significantly more likely to be no for disabled people in general, and for disabled people who are multiply marginalized specifically, even more so. But backing up from that a little bit, we have an even larger issue looming in front of us. When classes shut down and moved virtual during the beginning of this pandemic this spring, I was struck by the inhumanity of many school districts, colleges, and universities toward their students, both disabled and not. I teach as an adjunct faculty member at a university, and at no point did the university decide that they would suspend classes, suspend grading evaluations or assessments, and create mechanisms by which students wouldn't necessarily be subjected to worse financial hardship from losing a certain number of credits or scholarship eligibility or graduation dates, but was expecting students to be able to participate and perform to the same academic standards, albeit online and virtually, as they otherwise would have been, while hurtling toward the end of the semester on the original date as planned. And that, to me, struck me as grossly inhumane, because we are all, as a society, undergoing collective trauma from this pandemic. And yet you're expecting people to worry about doing their reading assignments, their journaling, their labs, submit their final papers, do their projects, their presentations, whatever it is that you're asking students to do, while also worrying about whether they and people they love are going to contract the virus, become sick, seriously ill, and or potentially die. And for those that are more vulnerable and belong to disabled and chronically ill communities where you are at a higher risk for serious injury, illness, or death from this virus, that sense of fear and trepidation is only exacerbated. So now we're looking toward the fall. We have more information available to us, which tells us that this virus is in some ways less scary than we originally thought, because it's not transmitted in all the ways that we might have originally been afraid of. But in other ways, it's scarier. In particular, having people in prolonged close contact indoors with poorly ventilated areas, even with masks, is not a guarantee that people will have significantly reduced risks of transmission and infection. It may slightly reduce that risk, but do you really want to go to a classroom where you have to sit at least 6 feet away from everybody at all times and then basically have to yell to be heard? It would be easier if you had the access to participate by video than to scream from the very back of the lecture hall to the TA and hope that someone understood you. But that being said, to me, the broader question is, why are we pushing for a return to normal? And the reason why is because we know that our access to food, to scholarship money, to housing, to stability, to community connection has been made contingent on the economy and education functioning in certain ways. And if our society were structured differently, then people wouldn't have to worry about being put between a rock and a hard place of being asked to choose between, do you work so you can earn money to pay for your food and rent, or do you stay safer from this virus? We wouldn't have to choose between, do we have to participate in classes under the same academic expectations of rigor and studying and deadlines and whatever it might be in order to be able to graduate on time, maintain access to scholarship funding, etc., or can we stay somewhat safer and also attend to our mental health during this time period? I'm very struck by the fact that several disabled students have reached out to me this summer and said that they are worried because their university will not allow them to return to campus because their access to support services and accommodations has been made contingent and conditional upon physical presence on campus. And they've been put in a catch-22, where the university is simultaneously telling them, we will only provide you with certain services, supports, and accommodations if you're present on campus, and we're barring you from returning to campus because of public health. How does that help anyone? There is no good choice here. It is an impossible choice, and in fact, you've been deprived of the autonomy to even make a meaningful choice, including a risky one. So that, to me, is the broader conversation that we need to be having.
No, I really appreciate that, and also the broader. I think you're right. Having children, two children, and making that decision, and one who is a child with a disability, that last point you made of access to support services is a challenge that cannot be accomplished from a remote learning environment. Even we do have the means to have the technology, but that does not give him access to the curriculum in a meaningful way and to honor his IEP. But we're forced in that same decision to expose him to harm and potential death at what risk. And so I do think, kind of circling, obviously, since I'm a lawyer, to think about the law, those are going to be the new special ed cases that are going to come out of this coming school year for those parents who are making those decisions, but still needing for the school to honor the IEP in this new world and a new way. So again, I really appreciate that and your perspective on college. It's going to be interesting to see what colleges are doing, but hearing what you're hearing from students with disabilities, there's a lot of potential legal problems there, and just moral problems, much more importantly, and enforcing someone. And I've heard of some parents who had children about to go to college arguing with universities saying, well, why am I paying out-of-state tuition when everything is online, or you're not allowing my student on campus, give me some type of reduced rate because I'm not getting the full experience, and that's not even, considering the disability piece in there. But I've seen some reports there from various parents saying that, that they or their children should not pay out-of-state tuition or full tuition for that matter. So thank you for that. Anything else on technology? One of the things that I did not clearly say, but I saw a piece about contact tracing, and that, to a lot of folks, discussion is, the states or the countries that contact trace better are better able to control COVID, if there's such a thing as control. But I don't want to misquote you, and I don't have the article right in front of me, but you were talking about the impact that contact tracing might have on the disability community, and it may not be positive. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Sure, this is Lydia. My concerns with contact tracing apps primarily revolve around protecting disabled people's freedom, privacy, autonomy, and control over how data about us is collected, when it is collected, who has access to it, and how it is used. Disabled people are already an over and hyper-surveilled population. We are constantly subjected to surveillance by state agencies trying to figure out if we are defrauding the system whenever we receive any kind of services, supports, or benefits. We are constantly being sought out as fakers when we ask for accommodations. People documented over the last couple of years a disturbing trend of Social Security agencies actually now monitoring disabled people's social media who receive Social Security benefits to look for pictures where the disabled people appear happy, under the horrifically misguided ableist belief that if you seem happy, you're probably not really disabled, so you're probably defrauding the system and should have your benefits taken away from you. And for other disabled people, this can lead to inadvertent disclosure of our disabilities to employers or to schools if we didn't necessarily disclose being disabled, if data about our lives, our whereabouts, who we visit, what offices we go to, what we are doing, who we are around, and whether or not we have potentially been deemed a riskier in terms of susceptibility to transmission and infection of the virus, could all be data that essentially reveals our disability status, which, as we all know, can lead to further discrimination, creation and cultivation of hostile environments where we work, where we live, where we go to school, if people know or believe that we are disabled or likely to become disabled. And so for me, the question isn't necessarily should we stop using any contact tracing practices, but is it possible ever to use contact tracing apps in a way that both protects people's privacy, people's autonomy, people's dignity, and also accomplishes the aims that they're set up to do? And the answer to that is probably no, because contact tracing apps do not provide the same function as people performing contact tracing investigations. That practice has been around for a very long time in the public health field as a way to track how epidemics spread and where epidemics are flaring or where they are in fact reducing the spread, and to determine who will need to be quarantining because they may have been exposed. And it is an effective and science-based method that people trained in public health methodology know how to use. People who are designing apps don't necessarily have that training, and even if they do, an app will not capture all of a person's contacts, because tracing where someone goes is not the same as knowing who they have interacted with. It also relies on people to self-report whether or not they have tested positive or negative, doesn't account for both false positives and false negatives in testing results, and as a result will lull people into complacency. If you've received 20 alerts that you may have been near somebody who might have tested positive for COVID, eventually you're going to start ignoring all of those alerts, like we ignore severe weather alerts, like the tornado warning that came out yesterday in DC, because we're just so desensitized to seeing those notifications that we stop acting on them. And so any potential benefit the app may have had to try to let people know that they might have been exposed will be far outweighed by the downside of its lack of functional utility and how people would actually interact with the app, as well as serious questions about the policies behind data use among the people that have created the app, that have deployed it, and in settings like schools and workplaces where employers might mandate that you install location tracking apps that are supposedly for contact tracing, or else you're not allowed to be on the premises. And that is disturbing.
Thank you, Lydia. I just wanted to let JJ know that we had 2 questions in the Q&A from Karen, and I'll let you read them if you're able to access the Q&A.
Let me look. I see them from Tyler.
That's in the chat. There should be another dialogue box.
Let me check here. Not the Q&A then. Oh, here we go. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Bringing that. All right. So the first question here is, over the 30 years on the ADA law, how much has grown for more needs? I work with Stu Brackley with the Arizona Commission for Deaf and Hard of Hearing, along with Ginny Clark and a few others, trying to get this passed. So how much has grown for more needs? Anybody want to take that question? I'm assuming they're trying to ask for what more can be grown or maybe an expansion of the ADA? Or how can the ADA be expanded? And please, Karen, clarify your question if I'm getting it completely wrong. But I'm just reading it here. Maybe I'll read the next question, and then maybe we can address both. Karen has another question that says, I would like to stress out to doctor's office to make accommodations for a hearing impaired. My father had a doctor appointment and my mom was refused due to my father's can't hear. I did call the doctor's office and inform them that they need to create some kind of support for those who don't hear. So I think more of a comment, but I think we're seeing some of the visitation, the need for advocates in the room at a higher level. I can just comment for during the pandemic, but I also want to open it up to the panelists if anybody wants to address either the 30-year ADA and maybe how that can be expanded, and then also any comments on having someone at a doctor's office with another person who may have a hearing impairment.
Long-standing practice, as I'm sure you know, that many of us as disabled people use, in that we will often bring people we trust, one or more people with us, to accompany us to doctor's appointments or to other sensitive and important appointments or events that we have to go to. And we might do that for any number of reasons: communication support, advocacy support, or just moral or emotional support. As far as what your legal rights are in such a situation, it's my understanding, and others feel free to correct me if I'm misstating this, that if you need as a reasonable accommodation to bring a specific support person with you for any disability-related reason, then you can assert that as a right and request that that be an accommodation. If a particular office has deemed that it is not safe to have more than one person present at an appointment under the current conditions of the pandemic, then depending on why you need that person to be present might dictate whether it would prevail and that you could have the person be available to you as an accommodation by video rather than being in person, or if they have to be there in person. So for example, if you needed the person with you there to interpret tactile sign language, then that requires someone to be in person with you. You cannot substitute that accommodation by having someone wait outside or be present virtually. If you need someone with you to help reposition yourself because of mobility disability, that person has to be with you in person. If you need someone to provide verbal-only communication support, then the doctor's office might be able to request that they can accommodate you, other than having that person come with you into the office, to be present by video rather than be in person. But that might be very situation specific, and obviously if you are experiencing a legal issue, you should actually seek legal advice and not ask us.
The only thing that I'll add to that is reading the scenario. If the parent in this situation is a person who is deaf and needs a sign language interpreter, under Title III, the public accommodation is the doctor's office in that situation, and they do have to provide effective communication. They shouldn't be using the family member to do the interpretation, which is a different question, and I'm not sure if you're asking this, but just to know that you are entitled to effective communication. During COVID, we have seen a lot more use of video remote interpreting, and again, so long as that's effective for the individual who is deaf or speaks American Sign Language, that can be utilized. So I don't know if that's the direct question there, but I felt to take the opportunity to address that as well. There is another question that came up here from Hannah that says, are there any suggestions for finding COVID-related issue or disability-specific rights-related info sheets for self-advocates? John, you want to take that one?
Sure. This is John. I would certainly direct you to my organization's national website. The ARC of the U.S. has a number of resources on the website, and that is simply thearc.org. You can find a whole page filled with resources for self-advocates, for advocates, for educators, for a variety of different people related to the pandemic. And if you're unable to find the things you need on that site, I certainly am happy to work with anybody to help them locate the kinds of information they're looking for. And not to volunteer you for anything, JJ, but I'm pretty certain that ACDL would take the same approach, and people just need to contact us, and we'll work with them to find what they need.
Yeah, most definitely. And Hannah, if you're in Arizona, we have Arizona-specific information, but also our national office, National Disability Rights Network, has a lot of resources as well. So depending on what type of self-advocacy material you're looking for related to these issues, both the ARC and the P&A protection advocacy agencies are out there. If you are in another state, there's a P&A in every state and territory. And Lydia, I saw you're serving in Disability Rights Maryland, so thank you for your service on the Family Advisory Council. So Sara, I'm going to stop talking here. I see on the agenda it's to pass back to you, so I'm going to mute myself for once.
Thanks, JJ. I think one of the questions that I want to ask, because we're on to the final question, and because we have half of the panelists, I think we're moving along a little quicker than we anticipated. I will get to the final question, or maybe JJ, you can take the final question, because I have a question that I wanted to ask John and Lydia, especially given you're both such committed advocates on all of these issues. As also a committed advocate on these issues, I have struggled with advocacy in the disability community over the years, and how to really effectively get the community behind certain issues, get the community out. And I know in some cases that's because of the disability itself for various individuals, and so that fair enough to that point. But it's how to get the community out, and also how to get the wider community to care. I've often said disability rights and disability justice issues for some reason aren't seen as sexy of issues as others, and it's frustrating sometimes, because we'd have rallies at the Capitol and we'd get like 10 people, and then there'd be a rally about education and there'd be thousands of people. Not that one necessarily is more important than the other, but it's a bit of a struggle. And I think especially now, the question that I have for you both is, now with COVID-19, there's obviously all these other layers of issues of how to advocate and how we're going to do that if we can't gather as easily and if it's not safe to gather. But setting that aside, we have discussed in this session how there's so much inequity and so many layers of society, whether you're talking about education or technology or healthcare. And how does this change our advocacy approach? Two-part question. How does it change our advocacy approach short-term due to COVID-19? How do we advocate effectively during COVID-19 while keeping people safe? And does it or should it change our advocacy approach going into the future? That we need so many changes to still occur, and how do we make them more effectively? And just share whatever thoughts you might have. I don't know, whoever wants to go first.
Lydia, would you like to go first?
This is Lydia. I've been talking a lot, so if someone else actually has something that they would like to say, I will shut up for a minute, unless everyone is actually just looking at me like, Lydia, please say something.
John, why don't you go first, and then Lydia?
I'm happy to go first, although Lydia, this is John. I feel the same way. I feel like I've just been blabbering on. But I think, okay, to my way of thinking, we have 30 years after the ADA was signed, 6 or 7 decades into what we could call a disability movement, we continue to have a disability crisis in this country. And that is because we as a society, systemically, we do not value people with disabilities. As a nation, we do not value people with disabilities. We marginalize them because we don't value them. The same is true of communities of color. We marginalize them because we don't value them. And until we either recognize the value in the people we represent, until society as a whole represents the value in the people we represent, we are going to continue to fight an uphill battle. Now, that's not to say it can't be done, because, I as an optimist, I want to believe that most people in this country, most people in this state do, in fact, recognize individuals with disabilities as human beings, worthy of our support, worthy of our connection, worthy of the funding that goes into our service system, and so on and so forth. I want to believe that people do, in their hearts, value the disability community. But if we do value, we have to speak up. We have to make that known. And the way we're going to make change is the way I think we've made change so far, the way change always gets made, and that is by people speaking out and speaking up. We, as advocates, as self-advocates, have to encourage, have to implore more people who are advocates and self-advocates to become involved, to be, whether it's technologically, and I think if nothing else, the pandemic has proved that there are technological solutions that can be employed if we can't be face-to-face with the people we need to meet with, we need to speak with, we need to advocate with. It may not be as personal. We might argue whether it's as effective, but certainly we have employed Zoom and WebEx and all of these other platforms for the last 4 or 5 months, and our work has continued. If that's what it takes, that's what it takes. That's what we have to do. We're facing a new and uncharted world. There's no question about it. We don't know what the future is going to hold. We don't know how much longer this virus is going to continue to have a hold on our lives. And so we have to be creative. We have to be innovative in figuring out ways that we can address the things that are important to our communities in light of the fact that we're facing very different circumstances than probably any of us could have imagined before. And I think we like to believe that we are creative folks. For decades, we have been finding creative solutions to better the lives of individuals with disabilities, to better the lives of people in marginalized communities. We can continue to do that. We have more tools now than we've ever had before. So it's a little pie in the sky, it's a little Pollyanna, I know, and I look around at the people that I work with, I look around at the organizations that we collaborate with, and we are filled with passion for doing this work. We are filled with a passion for making progress. If we continue to hold that passion, we can actually make good things happen. But I go back to what I said initially. It takes more people speaking out. It takes more people with the courage and the willingness to put themselves on the line in order to make positive progress. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but to me, that from an advocacy standpoint, that's pretty fundamental.
Thanks, John. Lydia?
This is Lydia. In many ways, I agree with the way that John framed this, but I would challenge that and push it farther. So when you speak, John, of we as a society do not value disabled people, we as a society do not value communities of color, that is still speaking from a perspective that centers and assumes as default white and non-disabled people. That's who the we is in that statement. And that we doesn't necessarily include us. Now, as folks know, being marginalized doesn't mean that we are free of or incapable of either internalizing the oppression used against us. Disabled people can be very ableist against ourselves and against others. People of color can be very racist within our own communities and across communities of color. But there's something to be said for that we. Who is this we that is doing the devaluing? In some ways, we are all expected and required to participate in belief systems that devalue whole communities of people. But at the same time, if we frame it as, well, our society doesn't really try to include or value disabled people, the presumption in that framing is that our society is at its baseline non-disabled people. who, out of an act of charity or kindness, or occasionally if they're using the word justice, will deign to include disabled people into that society. But where I want to challenge that further is, what do we even mean by including or even integrating disabled people into society? For me as a disabled person, I don't actually want to be included into a society that is profoundly ableist to its core, into a work ecosystem that values me based on my productivity. Oh, well, it values me now because it recognizes that I can be productive just in a neurodivergent way. But don't worry, I'm still productive. I don't actually want to be valued in that system. I want to be valued outside my productivity for reasons that have nothing to do with my productivity. Or, well, Lydia, we're so glad that you're here because, you've proven that disabled people can achieve. You went to college, you went to law school, that's impressive, and we want to show that all disabled people should have that opportunity. Yes, all disabled people should have a meaningful opportunity to pursue education when and how we want to study what we want to study for whatever reason we want to study it. And also, I shouldn't be lauded as you have succeeded because you've accomplished this particular educational achievement, because that's not what I should be valued for. So I don't want to be included into a society that says I'm valuable or I'm valued because I have now attained this particular accomplishment. So when I think about what it means to challenge others in society on the necessity and the urgency of doing disability work, I don't think of it as either how to talk about including disabled people into goals and structures that were already violent and harmful, or even to say, oh, disability matters too, because disability matters everywhere. Disabled people are everywhere. And any issue that other people say they are working on, they are focusing on, they are studying, they are researching, they are advocating on that affects them, also affects disabled people. And disabled people belong in every single community, and disabled people are also grossly overrepresented in every other marginalized community because of the effects of impoverishment, because of the effects of deprivation and of exploitation. People who live in impoverished conditions are more likely to experience various types of developmental and psychiatric disabilities because of the mental health stressors of impoverishment, because of poor living conditions created by slumlords and developers that push people out of their neighborhoods. People who live with the everyday effects of racism because they are Black, brown, Native, or other people of color are more likely to experience the mental health, stress, and trauma-related effects of everyday racism. You are more likely to experience the effects of environmental racism in causing chronic illness and developmental disabilities because of pollution, because of contamination and housing conditions, in water, in schools. You are more likely to cause disability and to have disability happen in your life and in your embodied experience if you belong to any other marginalized community. And so if you're talking about housing justice, that is a disability justice issue. If you are talking about reproductive justice, that is a disability justice issue. If you are talking about public health, that is a disability justice issue. If you are talking about the environment, that is a disability justice issue. There is no such thing as an issue that has nothing to do with disability. There is no such thing as a community that exists without disabled people in it. And so for me, as a disabled person, it's not even that we need to remind people that disabled people also exist as this somehow separate group, which of course we are a uniquely identifiable group of people, and of course we are extremely heterogeneous and diverse within that group of people, but also that disabled people are already there, directly impacted by anything else you are already working on, and disabled people are already leading work on all of these issues and have been forever, even if they're not using the same language that you and I are using now.
Thank you both for your passion on this topic. JJ, do you want to wrap up with the final question? Or we can conclude.
Yeah,
I will leave it to you, Sara Ann, and you, whatever you think.
Sure. Well, let's do the last question, and then we'll see what we have.
I actually may.
Go ahead, Tyler.
First off, this has been a really enlightening discussion, and Yeah, I randomly thought of this during the discussion about accessibility through the, in terms of healthcare or doctor's visits. What I assume, like, say that it was not a visit for you, but it's like if you were hearing impaired, but it was your son or daughter or child whose appointment where you have full custody over them, so it's like, and they're under 18, so you need to still be getting that information. Like you can still ask, hey, I need this accommodation because it's my child. Or very weird specific scenario, but it is important because we are, as you said, everywhere. We are parents. We are people who, are caretakers ourselves.
Right. No, Tyler, this is JJ. In the scenario that I'm hearing you say, if the parent is a person with a disability who needs the accommodation to have access to their children's appointments, the information that's discussed, yes, accommodations can be made, for that parent with the disability, and should be. I know we're talking about COVID, and there are a lot of walls being raised to access to, having two people in a room and all these other things. But generally speaking, and in kind of the scenario I heard you say, if the parent is a person with a disability and needs to have an accommodation to kind of effectively participate in those medical appointments in that scenario, most definitely the ADA would apply in that situation. So, no, I appreciate the question. So, Sarah Cater, I think we'll ask the last questions, and then we'll see how much I think we're doing pretty good on time, and may have a few last comments or a few questions. We'll look in the chat and see if there's some questions there as well. Why don't we do that right now? And let me expand and see. I don't see any right now. Go ahead.
And just another question I do have is, John, I think you specifically mentioned that here in Arizona, specifically, the laws that were passed in terms of congregate living facilities had leeway, I'm not sure if leeway would be the right word, but it were enabled for room for discrimination to happen based on the ableist quality of life view. So ideally, I guess my question is essentially, what exactly specifically were those loopholes, and ideally, how would they be closed if policy-wise?
I apologize. I had my phone muted there. The issues that we identified, and when I say we, I mean the complainants on the complaint led by Arizona Center for Disability Law focused really on four primary areas where we saw shortcomings. One was the issue of life expectancy for individuals who would be evaluated for whether they were deserving of life-saving care. So the issue of whether a person could survive, for example, the Crisis Standards of Care Plan right now says that you can evaluate based upon the 1 to 5 year survivability expectancy. That, to our way of thinking, that's a criterion that's inappropriate. The same section of the plan says that people will get priority if they have not yet had an opportunity to live through a series of life stages. Well, that's a kind of a hidden way of saying if you're old, you're less deserving of care because you've already lived through these various stages of life, whereas children or young adults, teenagers, have not had a chance to live through those life stages. That again is discriminatory based on age. That is, that's illegal. Basically, that's an abrogation of law. So those two criteria were identified: the life stages and life expectancy. There was also a provision in the plan that would allow for discrimination based upon the need of the individual for long-term medical care. Well, lots and lots of people in our country need medical care over the long term. It can be as simple as needing prescription medicines. It can be as extensive as needing ongoing use of a ventilator or a great many other scenarios. But using the need for long-term medical care as one of the criteria, again, we found really objectionable and inappropriate. A third was that there are these scoring instruments. There are these matrices I guess that's the best way I can describe it, that identify certain aspects of an individual's life and certain needs in that individual's life, certain circumstances, and make a judgment about the person's quality of life or make a judgment about the person's life expectancy, survivability, based upon what they consider to be objective scoring instruments. But in fact, most of those scoring instruments do not make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. And so we recommended, we requested that those scoring instruments be modified in order to accommodate the individuals that we represent. The state clearly didn't have an interest in doing that because they never responded to that. And finally, the Crisis Standards of Care Plan in Arizona does not make any reasonable accommodations for people who have communication challenges, people who need in-person supports to help them communicate between healthcare workers and the individual with a disability. So it has to do with the no visitor policies, basically, that the state implemented and that have been implemented in states around the country in order to reduce the risk of bringing infection into the hospital. Hospitals are preventing family members or other support workers from being there alongside individuals with disabilities. Well, the ADA clearly says that accommodation has to be made for individuals who need those accommodations. So you can't make it a blanket policy that individuals who are hospitalized cannot have a support person there if that person is under the protection of the ADA. So I don't know if I've done a very good job of explaining it, but those are the four primary areas that we found.
You've done a great job explaining that.
Okay. So all four of those were included in our complaint to OCR, and all four of those are the areas we hope and we're optimistic will be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, John. I think we'll go to the last questions here that are just open-ended questions for both John and Lydia. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the audience? I know there's people with disabilities, disability rights advocates on the phone, emergency managers. Basically, last thoughts. Kind of either to summarize or something that maybe we weren't asked that you'd like to address and comment on. We do have approximately 20 minutes of it doesn't have to be an equal split, but most definitely each of you should have an opportunity. And anybody want to go first? How about we put Lydia on the spot this time, John? Because last time we asked you to speak first. If that's fair by you all, let's go. Lydia, you're up first.
Sure. I have spent a lot of time in conversation with folks over the last few months about the many ways that technology and the pandemic and at least a pause on normal life have both been incredibly beneficial and incredibly harmful for disabled people. Sometimes the same people and at the same times. Being able for those whose jobs allow it to work from home can be both an improvement in many ways and also terrible, CEG, ADD. And similarly, being able to take a break from the demands of travel for those who normally travel frequently can be very restful. And on the other hand, suddenly being expected to turn every meeting into a video call when a 2-line email or a 2-second phone-only call probably would have been fine has also become incredibly overwhelming and exhausting for basically everybody, even non-disabled people. So, and for many of us as well, the sudden availability of things to do virtually has been a boon for our social lives, for our emotions, for our mental health, and at the same time reminds us of how disposable and expendable most people view us as. Because if it weren't for the pandemic, the vast majority of events and programming would still require in-person participation and never be made available in a virtual format. And of course, as talked about earlier, things in a virtual format can also further exacerbate inaccessibility for other disabled people. So there are ways in which, for us as disabled people, sometimes even for the same disabled people, this pandemic and its incredible and unprecedented in our lifetimes disruption of everyday life activity have both great and awful. And one thing that I wish more folks were talking about is just how traumatizing of an experience this is for literally everyone. And there are some things that shouldn't go back to normal because it is not humane to expect people to be working or studying in the same way as we were before the pandemic. And in fact, some of the ways that we were working and studying before the pandemic were also inhumane. So expecting us to continue is even worse. And all that to say, of course, I understand that it is also true that for many of our mental health, we need some things to go back to normal. For us, we crave social interaction for most people who are not extreme introverts. And I'm on the introverted spectrum, right? But we all crave some amount of interaction in some format with people, even if it is only a little, and even if it can be online only, that's fine. And to live completely in isolation with no form of contact with anybody at all is not how we were designed to live as human beings. And for many of us as disabled people, lifelong isolation has been the norm. There was no difference when the rest of the world went into quarantine, because we still did not have friends to spend time with in person, because we still did not have places that we could get to affordably, accessibly, and safely, or where we were invited or welcome. And so now, seeing everybody else suddenly able to build social lives online, and for many of us who remain isolated, that can be very painful and very difficult. So the reason I bring this up is because in the work that I do, informed by a practice of disability justice, which I know I've spoken about a bit earlier this evening, helps us understand how necessary and vital it is for each of us to be able to receive care and to have opportunities for rest. And also helps us understand how the society in which we live actively deprives and prevents us, especially multiply marginalized people, from being able to access and receive care and rest by making it impossible for us to ever have a break. And so my ask and my hope for those of you who are here is both that you will be able to practice being compassionate with yourselves when you are struggling with the effects of this trauma on your life, your functioning, your mental health, your work, your home. And also, where possible, for those of you who do have the capacity and any access to resources or privilege, to make that space available for those who lack it.
Thank you for that. John.
Well, that's a hard act to follow. I echo everything Lydia said, and I applaud you, Lydia, for your comments. I'm grateful, truly grateful for your insights. I really don't know what what I can add, I, you know, it's, the work we do is tremendously demanding. We all know that. Whether you do it professionally or whether you do it personally, whether you're an advocate or a self-advocate because it's the life you live, or whether you're employed in this field, it doesn't matter. The work is challenging. The work is hard because we are trying to change perspectives. We are trying to enlighten people. We are trying to build a more humane and a more just society. And it's not something that has, the progress we've made so far is not something that has occurred overnight. It's not something that will suddenly become a panacea in the foreseeable future. But it is my hope, absolutely, that as Lydia said, we won't go back to being just what we were before when this has passed. First of all, we don't know how soon it's going to pass, but let's take the lessons we've learned about treating each other with more respect and more compassion, and let's embed those in who we are. And if we do so, and if we can spread this message, if we can continue to impress upon people the importance of that, maybe we can bring about some important and much needed progress in this area for all marginalized people, for people with disabilities, people of color, aging adults, you name the community, maybe we can make a difference for them. As far as the work we're doing here in Arizona, we need the involvement, we need the dedication, we need the voices of anyone who cares about this work. And the more voices we hear, the more diverse the community that comes together to do this work, the more success we will have, and you know, the better it's going to make the world in which we live. I like the notion that we can be more humane and more compassionate coming out of this than we were going in, and I do believe that we've learned a great many things that can help us along that path. So I hope we will make use of those lessons, and you know, we'll continue to fight battles. We'll continue to meet opposition, but step by step, we will move forward.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Lydia. I'm going to see if there's any questions, but again, I think you both provided some great information today, and your vision for kind of post-pandemic, whenever that might be, is something that I hope for as well. I'm just speaking with a family member yesterday about kind of we're not going to return to what we knew before, and we shouldn't. And then that's kind of my language of what I heard you all say. There's a lot of improvements that can be made and should be made, especially coming out of the lessons we're learning at this time. So I do hope we progress as a society. It was also, to go back to something, Lydia, you were talking about it, that you can't talk about all these issues without talking about disability. I really appreciate that, because Joe Shapiro, who's an author from NPR, presented at a national conference, and he challenged anybody to come up with some area of life that did not have involvement with the disability community, and he was offering $100, and obviously I'm always one for free money, but I could not come up with, no one could come up with, and he kept his money, and rightfully so. And he was making the same point I think you were making earlier as well, and I do think people need to acknowledge that there can't be a discussion on any of those topics, or any topic really, without being inclusive of disability. I'm looking out into the virtual sphere to see if we have questions, but you both did, you know, although we were missing two panelists, I think you addressed all the issues that we had hoped to today. And Sarah Kada or Sara Ann out there, or Tyler, anything, final words from you all, or final questions for either John or Lydia?
Well, again, thank you both for being there. Lydia, you know, really admire your passion in regards to calling out the belief that is sort of culturally instilled in many of us, that it's centered, that everything centers around productivity. As I have ADHD, and so productivity can be something, just in general, that is difficult for me. So I'm curious, in the ideal world, how would we sort of prioritize or balance, everything else in our life that needs to be elevated in the way it's not currently valued in our society, to be with still being productive. I get.
This is Lydia. One thing that strikes me often is the pushback that we'll often get about conversations on productivity are, yeah, but I don't have a choice but to be productive, because if I'm not productive, I can't pay for my rent, I can't pay for food, and I have to push myself through illness, through injury, through brain fog, through bad mental health days, and if I don't, then I'm screwed. And I think it is both true that it's a privilege to be able to attend to one's mental health and not have to work all the time, and it's a privilege to be able to push through pain and work anyway. And either way, those scenarios just illustrate how harmful our current political and cultural systems are, in that we have made the ability to have safe, accessible, and affordable housing contingent on the ability to work. Most people in the United States are worried that if they can't get employer-sponsored health care, they're not going to get good health insurance. And if you don't have health insurance, well, good luck with those emergency room bills, which we all know are literal exploitation and robbery. So for me, the question about what it means to build a more humane, just, caring, and loving society isn't about preventing people from working or being productive, but about enabling people to work and be productive on our own terms, and for work to be never made contingent on, contingent for, or conditional for having access to housing or healthcare or food. In any society, whether at the very small neighborhood level or at the macro societal level, there are tasks that have to happen. If you don't have anyone to tend to sanitation, that's how we all get cholera and die. If you don't have anybody attend to roads and infrastructure and power lines, well, we don't have electricity anymore, which, by the way, some disabled people need to do things like move around and breathe. If we don't have functioning roads, well, a lot of people can't go outside. So there are things that we have to do in any neighborhood or society to function, and that means that some folks are going to have to do that work. And the exact specifications of what is a just way to distribute or divide that work will also inevitably be context specific and culturally informed and responsive. But at a base level, for me, a society can't be just if it unfairly distributes expectations of labor for labor that has to be done, or if it makes your ability to do labor or the expectation that you do labor a precondition for safety, for health, for food, or for housing. So in an ideal society, we would be able to work when we choose to, except for the work that we're capable of doing and that must be done for the society to function, and that work would never be connected to our basic human needs otherwise, because people deserve housing and food and safe community, and safety is defined by themselves in their own communities. And that's true whether or not they can do work under our current society's expectations and assumptions for what real work looks like.
Yeah, because the part of one of the things you said that really stuck with me and resonated with me was when you talked about how, I'm not sure if this was exactly the way you phrased it, but it was essentially like, oh, you know, I'm beautiful. Oh, I went to law school and this, or, you know, I have a disability and all these lists of accomplishments that still prioritize your productivity and your labor. What resonated with that for me in sort of was the fact that like I said, I'm about to start my second year of college, and I remember last summer and last spring doing all these scholarship interviews, and I don't mean this in a braggy way, although I am proud to say I do have a rather impressive resume, and I would, you know, during these interviews, I'd hear, you know, because I'll always bring up that I'm on the spectrum, I advocate for myself, and they'd always give me some version of that, which, you know, I appreciate the sentiment because I know it is a genuine compliment, but I also, you know, have that feeling of it's all like, oh, you know, I only was able to, you know, get, you know, I'm privileged in a sense, it's all like I had access, well, one, I'm a cisgender white male from a upper middle class economic background. I had access to, you know, really good accommodations throughout my years of schooling. I have two moms who are both educators and are thoroughly like invested in how can we help you, how can we, you know, help you to grow and help you with, you know, becoming the best version of yourself. And so, you know, sometimes whenever I hear that compliment of, oh, you know, you're so accomplished, you know, you're on the spectrum, but you have all this list of accomplishments, I always sort of have that moment of guilt. So like, yeah, but, well, both graciousness and guilt in the sense of I was privileged, I had all these opportunities that I know if I were born with, you know, different circumstances I might not be able to get, but I would still have that in the eyes of God or the universe, or just the phrasing of all of us are created equal. I know I still have that same amount of worth as a human being, and so I will sometimes feel guilty about that. And like I said, still gracious because it's so seeped into our culture that some of it is unconscious bias. But that really resonated with me.
This is Lydia, and just to close out, I guess, on this note, since we're about out of time, for me, the struggle isn't necessarily in hearing people want to, you know, appreciate and acknowledge things that are in fact accomplishments. But it is in people determining that I am valuable or should be listened to or respected based solely on very ableist, classist, and racist expectations for what counts as an accomplishment. I am proud of having gone to law school, and I should be. And anyone else who's gone to law school should also be proud of it. However, people shouldn't treat me as someone to be respected simply because I went to law school. That shouldn't be the reason that people think, oh, Lydia is this amazing advocate because Lydia happened to go to law school. There are a lot of people that are amazing advocates that have never gone to law school or even college.
And a lot of crummy lawyers, too.
And there are also awful lawyers. Yeah, not even just crummy, like awful lawyers. Like
Michael Cohen.
They're fucking bastards and assholes.
Rudy Giuliani.
Right? So, you know, on that very happy note, you know, my real takeaway from that, Tyler, is that we should be able to be proud of what we do. And at the same time, remember that why we deserve to be human is not something we have to prove. We don't have to prove that we count as human. We don't have to prove that we deserve rights or justice or freedom or safety. Everybody deserves rights and freedom and justice and safety. No one should ever have to prove it.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, indeed.
I know we're at the end of our time. I just wanted to add one thing, if I may. I remember when I was at the Center for Disability Law, we were advocating against a bad bill, because that's what you do in Arizona. And I overheard a lobbyist say, well, you know, those disability advocates are cranky but politically powerless. And that stung. And, you know, we are kind of cranky, I guess, rightly so, cranky and angry. But in that context, well, what I want to say is political power is sort of subjective often and changes depending on the day sometimes. And I used to sort of think it was so much tied directly to money, and it is in some ways. And so when you are a group that has a lot of money, you may in fact, as a result of that money, have lobbying power. But power is more than just money, and you can have a lot of power without money in some cases, certainly if you have a lot of numbers. And what we've in this time, in part, is that there are lots of us. And so we can wield that power together. And one of the most important ways we can do that is through voting. And so when I hear a lot of these inspiring and important points about how do we make these change, how do we create a society that is just for everyone, you know, so many are making decisions based on what society looks like that is not just. And how do we get those people out and get people in that can make the kind of change that we need? And it's through making our voice heard, right? And one of the important ways to do that is through voting. I know ACL is doing a virtual voter drive right now, which AZ Silk is a part of. But wherever we are located, we must vote. We must register others to vote and encourage people to vote. And I think that's one of the most powerful ways that we can get this change that we all seek. That is what I wanted to say.
And hello, you guys. Just to close up with the tech side, I want to thank everyone for participating, and I will be getting back to you via email. It'll take me just a moment to close everything up, and you have a wonderful day.
Everyone's LinkedIn, by the way.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for hosting.